Many have learned the history of American slavery, though many are unaware of some of the most influential names within this history. One of these fascinating lives was lived by a woman named Biddy Mason. Biddy Mason was a black woman born as a slave who triumphantly rose through society and became one of the most influential black entrepreneurs in California history. Like most lives of 19th century African Americans, Mason's life started in hardship and chains. Mason was born as a slave in Georgia. She was born on the 15th of August in a place called Hancock County. However, at the time in history, many black slaves were often separated from family at very young ages. Mason was separated from her family as a baby and became the slave of a company called Mason was moved from Georgia to Mississippi on a plantation that she would soon raised by the other Shortly after Mason's youngest daughter was born, life on the plantation began to change. Robert Smith and his wife both made the decision to convert to Mormonism and began to make plans to move to Utah. Not only would the Smiths take the trip west, but their slaves would also take the long trip. However, it was known that the price of wagons and travel was steep, and Mr. Smith did not have this money readily available. It was a real possibility that slaves would be sold to raise money for this trip west, and Mason feared possible separation from her children. Luckily, after all arrangements were made for the trip, Mason and all three daughters came along. The trail to Utah was long and tiring for the slaves, since many of the wagons were reserved for whites only. The trip also consisted of work for Mason, who had to tend to the slave owners' cattle and delivered 4 children while on the way to Utah. The wagon train finally reached Utah in November of 1848. The Smiths and their slaves would stay in Utah for the next 3 years, before Robert and Rebecca Smith answered a call from Brigham Young, the leader of the Mormon religion, to create a new town in California. Biddy Mason and her 3 daughters would soon find themselves in the free state of California, the place where their lives would finally change. During their stay in California, under control of the Smith family, Biddy Mason and the other slaves lived in the San Bernardino area. While there, Biddy was able to make connections with a wider group of other boys. One of these important connections was with a man named Robert Owens. Owens happened to be a free slave who owned his own business. It was Owens that provided Mason with all the information and necessary resources to gain her freedom. By this time, the search for her own freedom, as well as the freedom of all the Smith slaves, was at the forefront of Biddy's mind. However, before she could take action, Mason had to deal with the ever-changing mind of Robert Smith. In the winter of 1855, Smith told his family and the slaves that they would be making a trip back east to live in Texas. Since Texas was not yet a free state, Mason knew that this was her one and only chance to free her chains. Before the group's detour towards Los Angeles for supplies, Biddy had given a letter to a friend to pass off to Robert Owens, someone she knew would know what to do. And he did know exactly what to do. Owens informed the sheriff of Smith's illegal action of keeping slaves in a free state. While staying in a makeshift camp in the Santa Monica Mountains outside of Los Angeles, the Smith group was confronted by the sheriff. Robert Smith was then served with papers signed by a judge of the Southern District of California, Benjamin Hayes. The letter stated that all Smith's slaves had asked for their freedom and that they must all be present in court. During Biddy Mason's trial in court, something strange and unexpected occurred. Before learning that he had been bribed away from the case, Mason's lawyer, who was hired for her by Robert Owens, did not show up to court. This was especially unsettling because at the time it was illegal for slaves or any black person to speak or testify within court. Anything that Biddy wanted to say to the judge had to be said to a lawyer on her behalf. However, Judge Hayes took it upon himself to see the trial through. As a loophole, Hayes took Biddy into his office with 2 witnesses, and it was here where he asked Mason if she desired to be free. After their discussion, the judge made a formal announcement to the court that Biddy and all the rest of Smith's slaves, including her 3 daughters, had been granted their freedom. Now that Biddy had gained her freedom, the only question on her mind was, what now? The judge from her trial introduced Biddy to a physician named Dr. Griffin that hired her as a medical assistant and a midwife. This was how Biddy would make her living. For a few years after Mason and her family were freed, Biddy was able to rent a home for her and her daughters. However, Biddy wanted more for her life. She wanted to own her home, an option that was not previously available. After 10 years of hard work delivering children all over Southern California, Mason had saved enough money to buy a piece of property. She built a building upon this land that she began to rent to other individuals as storage. This business also added to her income, and Biddy would soon find herself a wealthy woman. With her newfound wealth, Biddy took it upon herself to always look to improve her community. For instance, after a flood of the Los Angeles River, Mason asked a market owner to allow people to buy whatever it was they needed and charge it to her account. Her philanthropy did not stop there, however. Biddy was a member of a white church in town that allowed her to attend because of her monetary contributions, but she knew that the poor blacks in the city also deserved a place of worship. Therefore, in 1872, Biddy had the first African Methodist Episcopal Church of Los Angeles built on the piece of property that she owned. It was a place of refuge for many poor blacks that had no other option. And still, her contributions to the community did not stop there. Biddy's grandchildren had been attending a school in Stockton because there was no school for black children in Los Angeles. This troubled Biddy. So, with a monetary contribution by Biddy, the church was able to open a school, which was the first school for blacks in the city. Biddy was able to see her wealth and contributions to her community prosper for the rest of her life. Biddy Mason eventually passed on January 15, 1891. She was buried in an unmarked grave and rests there for the next century. However, in 1988, the First African Methodist Episcopal Church took it upon themselves to mark Biddy's grave with a headstone and a memorial in her honor. In what was a beautiful, full-circle moment, the first black mayor of the city of Los Angeles spoke at this memorial. The story and life of Biddy Mason is an outstanding one. From being born in chains to dying free in her own home, Mason is one of the most influential faces of California history because of her contributions to her community. Because of her drive and determination that got Mason her wealth, she was able to contribute something to her community that will forever be priceless: education. She allowed every black child in Los Angeles to have access and an opportunity at an education. something that was not available to Biddy and her own family. This act forever changed the structure of Los Angeles' Black community and set in motion a change within the state of California. It was small acts like Masons that allowed individuals to eventually fight for more justice and equality in this country. Mason's life is forever memorialized within the city of Los Angeles and the history of California.